I never expected to find myself deep in the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, working for a clandestine government agency. But here I was, tramping through the dense undergrowth, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The air was crisp and carried the earthy scent of pine. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the thick canopy overhead. My name is Emily Foster, and I'm from Alaska. I've always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, exploring nature. But I never imagined those interests would lead to a job like this. Desperate times call for desperate measures, though. Drowning in student loan and credit card debt, I needed a lifeline. And one day, out of the blue, I was approached about an opportunity with a secretive branch of the government. They needed people with backcountry skills for special assignments. The pay was great, and it sounded like an adventure. I signed on the dotted line. Now, on my first mission, doubts gnawed at me as I followed my training officer, Sergeant Alvarez, through the trackless woods. Our job was to locate a group of hikers who had disappeared in this remote area a week ago. But something felt off. The hush that hung over the forest was unnatural, foreboding. The hairs on my neck prickled. Alvarez must have sensed my unease. "Keep sharp, eyes peeled," he said in a low voice. "Anything moves, call it out immediately." His hand rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder. I nodded, hand tightening on my own weapon. They told us to be prepared for anything. Rogue bears, escaped fugitives, drug cartels guarding hidden pot fields. But the veteran soldiers spoke of other threats in hushed whispers when they thought us rookies weren't listening. Things that couldn't possibly be real. As if on cue, a blood-curdling scream rang out from deep in the forest, shattering the eerie silence. Birds exploded from the treetops. Alvarez and I froze, looked at each other. The screaming continued, growing more shrill and agonized. It sounded human, but not quite. A cold dread settled in my gut. "Go, go, go." Alvarez sprinted toward the sound, dodging between trees, and I followed close on his heels. Branches whipped at my face and undergrowth snatched at my legs. The screaming cut off abruptly, leaving ringing silence in its wake. We stumbled to a halt in a small clearing. At first glance, it looked like an animal attack. Blood splattered the fallen leaves and smeared the nearby tree trunks. Bits of shredded clothing and flesh were strewn about. But something was very wrong with the scene. The torn remnants of clothing were odd, tattered suits and dresses from a bygone era rather than modern outdoor gear. And the remains, they didn't look quite human. Limbs bent at impossible angles, hands tipped with bony claws, grinning skulls that seemed elongated and animal-like. What is this?" I whispered hoarsely, fighting down rising nausea. "Christ," Alvarez hissed. He crouched by a severed arm, still clad in a moldering suit sleeve. "This isn't recent. This is old." A piercing wail sounded behind us. We spun around to see a emaciated, vaguely human figure lurch out of the underbrush, ribs protruding beneath pallid flesh, long arms ending in sharp talons. Lipless jaws parted to emit another unearthly shriek as it bounded toward us. Alvarez opened fire, the shots cracking like thunder in the quiet forest. The thing jerked and stumbled as bullets slammed into it, but it kept coming. I raised my own gun and added to the fusillade. Finally, mercifully, the creature dropped mere feet away, oozing black ichor. We stood over it, panting, pulses pounding. It looked like something out of a nightmare or horror movie, not anything that should exist in the real world. "What is that thing?" I finally managed. "Legend come to life," Alvarez replied grimly. "Every culture has stories. Wendigo, skinwalkers, Yeti." He looked at me with haunted eyes. "Congratulations, Private. You just got your first introduction to the real reason this unit exists. To hunt the nightmares that turned out to be real after all." He clicked on his radio. "Sierra Actual, this is Alpha Team. We have contact. Code Black, repeat code Black." As I stared at the twisted remains of the creature, one thing became crystal clear. Those missing hikers weren't lost. They were dead, and now we had to make sure whatever killed them never preyed on anyone else again. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of the horrors lurking in the dark corners of the American wilderness. Horrors we now had to confront head-on, and if we failed, the nightmares would spread. Deep in the lush, temperate rainforests of Oregon, our clandestine unit confronted fresh horrors. The soggy detritus of the forest floor muffled our footsteps as Sergeant Alvarez and I crept through the verdant understory of ferns and moss-clad maples. Mist curled between the trees, turning the woods into a monochromatic watercolor. This time, a U.S. Forest Service ranger had vanished on a routine patrol. With her decades of experience in these woods, it seemed unlikely that she'd simply gotten lost. Our taciturn mission commander, Major Briggs, suspected something more sinister at work. After 3 days of fruitless searching, we finally discovered the ranger's truck. It sat abandoned on an overgrown logging road, doors flung open, windshield starred from the inside with cracks. Rust-colored stains splashed the dashboard and driver's seat. With mounting unease, we followed a trail of disturbed undergrowth and broken branches away from the truck, weapons at the ready. The forest seemed to grow more oppressive the deeper we went, the air heavy and still. I felt unseen eyes boring into my back. "Hold up," Alvarez suddenly whispered, fist raised. "There's something ahead." I squinted through the shifting mist. An ungainly figure shuffled between the trees some 50 meters away, hunched and lurching. It looked vaguely human but wrong, misshapen. Alvarez keyed his radio. "Sierra, Alpha, we have possible contact with target. Moving to intercept, over." "Alpha Sierra, confirmed. Proceed with caution." Major Briggs's clipped reply crackled back. We began closing the distance, picking our way as quietly as possible over the uneven ground. As we drew nearer, the feeling of unease grew into outright dread. There was something unnatural about the figure, something that set off deep primal alarms in my brain. At 20 meters, it must have finally heard us. The creature whirled with shocking speed to face us, mouth gaping in a silent scream. I recoiled involuntarily. Its face was a ruin of livid fungal growth, shelf-like brackets protruding from skin that looked more vegetal than flesh. Empty sockets seemed to weep with black ichor, and a tangle of root-like tendrils spilled over a shredded ranger uniform. The name tag read Hawkins, but there was nothing human left. "Contact!" Alvarez yelled, opening fire. The creature bounded toward us with terrifying speed, shrugging off the hail of bullets perforating its body. A tide of lesser horrors boiled out of the mist behind it, chittering, skittering things that looked like nightmarish fusions of insect, fungus, and mammal. Time seemed to dilate as I emptied my rifle into the onrushing horde. Fungal puffballs exploded from shattered exoskeletons and geysers of spores filled the air. Desiccated bodies fell twitching only to be trampled by fresh horrors surging forward. The ranger thing was nearly on us, its fellows swarming close behind. My gun ran dry. Alvarez fumbled for another clip. An insectile horror leapt for his throat, scissored mandibles flashing. He screamed. Then thunder cracked from the mist. The creature's head disintegrated in a spray of chitin and slime. More gunfire roared, and the fungal tide recoiled as if slapped. Figures clad head to toe in mottled containment suits emerged from the trees, flamethrowers pumping gouts of cleansing fire. I collapsed against a tree, chest heaving. Alvarez looked shell-shocked. Of Hawkins' body, only smoldering mycelia remained. A containment-suited figure approached us, face obscured behind a reflective visor. "Sergeant Alvarez? Private? Name?" a muffled voice inquired. "I'm Lieutenant Vega, U. Samriad. Consider yourselves relieved, boys." What was that?" Alvarez croaked out. "Fungal parasite we've designated Ophiocordyceps formicide, ant shroom for short," Vega replied grimly. "We think it's an emergent superstrain that infects and hijacks multiple hosts, insect, animal, human. Hawkins must have stumbled across a growth." My mouth felt desert dry. Ant shroom, parasitic fungi commandeering human bodies. This threat made the Wendigo look tame. Vega clapped our shoulders. "There will be a full debrief back at base. For now, just be thankful you survived. Most don't get that lucky their first encounter." As the USAMRID team incinerated the fungi-ravaged parts of the forest, I wondered how many nightmares this unit faced on a regular basis, and how long our luck would hold out. Months passed in a blur of clandestine missions across the country as our team confronted monsters that mortal imaginations had consigned to myth and legend. But a new assignment in the backwoods of Pennsylvania would prove one of our greatest challenges yet. Locals had reported livestock mutilations and glimpses of deformed figures lurking in the forests of the Poconos. The incidents coincided with a spike in missing persons cases. Caught up in the economic downturn, the small towns welcomed the influx of government activity. They had no idea of our unit's true nature or the horrors we hunted. Under the cover of night, Sergeant Alvarez and I crept through dense stands of hemlock and spruce, a gibbous moon peering through the canopy like a baleful eye. The air smelled loamy, but beneath it lay the faintest rotten whiff like spoiled meat. An hour into our recon, we reached a small clearing in the forest. What we found there froze the blood in my veins. Animal carcasses littered the glade, cattle and sheep ripped open and strewn about, ribbons of flesh trailing from cracked bones. Viscous splatters stained the ground. Most looked days old, crawling with maggots. One appeared more recent. But that wasn't the worst of it. At the center of the charnel display rose a towering arrangement of branches, bones, and flesh. Rotting deer skulls crowned its peak, empty sockets seeming to leer. Tattered skin stretched between ribs and femurs in a grisly webwork. It vaguely resembled the bizarre bone chandelier we'd found in that California mine shaft, clearly crafted by the same minds and hands, or claws. "Looks like we found where those missing livestock ended up," Alvarez muttered, face grim. I nodded tightly, unable to tear my gaze from the macabre tower. Some branches looked suspiciously humanoid in shape and size. I flashed to the missing persons reports and felt my gorge rise. A branch snapped in the forest behind us. We spun, rifle snapping up to firing position. Alvarez's flashlight beam penetrated the night, catching a glimpse of sickly pale flesh and far, far too many teeth. Then the beam fell on a tiny, huddled figure crouched behind a stump. A child's tear-streaked face stared back at us, eyes wide with terror. My heart lurched. A little girl, out here? She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. I lowered my gun and stepped forward. "Hey, sweetheart, it's okay," I called softly. "We're here to help. Are you lost?" She remained silent, trembling, gaze flicking to the tree line as if at any moment something terrible might come bursting out. Seeing her fear, I holstered my weapon and knelt, extending a hand. "Don't be scared. We'll get you out of here, okay? Back to your family. I promise." For a moment she hesitated, then started to uncurl from her hiding place. I smiled reassuringly. But as she emerged into the moonlight, I gasped in horror. Blood and worse stained her tattered dress. Clumps of gore crusted her chin and throat. And her teeth, they didn't look right. Too pointed, too numerous. I stumbled back as Alvarez yanked me to my feet. "What the hell?" I choked out. She's just a kid." "Not anymore," he replied hoarsely, face ashen. "Whatever's out there, it got to her." As he spoke, more small shapes slipped out of the darkness at the edge of the clearing. Wild eyes and wide, bloody grins flashed in the moonlight. Childish giggles drifted through the night, but there was a manic, feral edge to them. The little girl suddenly lunged, howling, mouth yawning inhumanly wide. Alvarez fired on pure reflex. The shot struck her square in the chest. She crumpled, still snarling around a mouthful of shark-like teeth. The other children, if you could call them that anymore, surged forward, howling. Alvarez and I opened up, the night roaring with muzzle flashes and inhuman shrieks. Bullets tore through small bodies, but they kept coming, seemingly oblivious to pain. One leapt on Alvarez's back, teeth and nails scrabbling for his throat. I wrenched it away and smashed it down, bone snapping beneath my rifle butt. Another latched onto my arm, biting deep. I screamed and flung it away, its skull cracking against a tree trunk. It was over in moments, the sudden silence broken only by our ragged breathing and the soft, wet sounds of the dying. Black blood pooled in the moonlight. Alvarez looked stricken, staring at the broken bodies. They'd been kids once, before something twisted them into monsters. "What the fuck is happening?" he whispered. "Nothing good," I replied shakily, feeling the weight of failures upon failures. All those missing people, warped and turned by something I shuddered to imagine. "We need to call this in, Sarge. This is so much worse than we thought." The wind shifted, bringing a charnel reek with it, and the trees came alive with gleaming eyes and grinning mouths, fresh horrors boiling out of the night. Our unit barely escaped the Pennsylvania woods alive that night, fleeing the gibbering hordes that poured from the forest. Whatever dark force lurked in those hills, it was far stronger and more insidious than anything we'd yet faced. Badly shaken, we licked our wounds and tried to regroup. I stared at the photo in my shaking hands, a treasured snapshot of hometown from better days, before monsters were real and my life had purpose and meaning. What was I doing out here, a pawn in a shadow war that never ended? But the horrors wouldn't let me rest. Weeks later, reports filtered in of strange sightings around an abandoned CCC camp deep in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest of Wisconsin. Locals spoke of eerie lights flickering in the old stone buildings, inhuman figures skulking in the tree line. The missing person cases mounted. Alvarez slammed a fist on the table as he skimmed the reports. More kids vanished around there, just like in Pennsylvania. I'm seeing a pattern, and I don't like it one bit. I knew he still carried the guilt of the innocents we couldn't save, the things we had to do. I felt it gnawing at my own soul. And now it looked to be happening again. Major Briggs was characteristically blunt in our mission briefing. Whatever is preying on these towns, it's escalating. The powers that be are concerned, and that means we need to get ahead of this. You two have experience with this sort of incursion. Find out what we're dealing with and shut it down. So once more, Alvarez and I found ourselves creeping through moonlit forests, the musty scent of leaf litter thick in the air. The old CCC camp squatted in a clearing ahead, stone walls crumbling beneath cloaking vines and creepers. Shadows pooled thick around the empty windows and doorways. I've got a bad feeling about this, Alvarez muttered, mirroring my own unease. The forest surrounding the camp felt watchful, heavy with a sense of coiled menace. We took up positions to either side of the dark main entrance, rifles readied. I caught Alvarez's eye, nodded, and we slipped inside, flashlight beams probing the gloom. The interior looked like something out of a slasher flick, peeling lead paint, scattered debris, and strange stains splashed across the walls. A rotten smell hung thick in the air, underlain by a coppery tang I recognized all too well. Blood. The hairs prickled on the back of my neck as we moved deeper into the ruin. Our lights played over a scene of carefully organized chaos. Occult sigils daubed the crumbling walls, interspersed with strange, spiky writing in a language I'd never seen before. Bundles of desiccated herbs and bones hung from the ceiling. In an inner chamber, my flashlight fell across a sight that wrenched the breath from my lungs. A stone altar squatted against the far wall, its slab stained rusty brown. Shackles ending in wicked hooks dangled from the ceiling above it and huddled on the floor around it. "Oh God," Alvarez choked. "The kids. We're too late." Small bodies lay crumpled across the room, a dozen at least. Dried blood crusted their torn clothing. Some looked like they'd been gnawed on, flesh worry from limbs and faces. Flies buzzed in thick clouds. I stumbled back, fighting nausea. They'd been tortured, bled, and left for dead. Some of them looked pitifully young, no more than 5 or 6. What kind of monsters could do something like this? From the darkness beyond the altar, a low growl rolled, slick, glistening shapes detached from the shadows, rising on twisted limbs. Gelatinous flesh undulated, sprouting mouths filled with needle teeth. My mind flashed to the briefing reports and a chill prickled my spine. Deep ones. They'd found their way inland. Alvarez and I opened fire as one, bullets thudding into flabby bodies that rippled and reformed around the impacts. Icarus blood sprayed, and the nearest abominations fell writhing, but more boiled out of hidden alcoves and crevices. We fought our way back through the labyrinthine halls, chased by skittering claws and demented piping cries. I felt the clammy flick of a webbed hand and whirled, smashing the twisted thing back with my rifle butt. It gibbered, shark-like teeth gnashing, black eyes alight with malice. And then daylight beckoned, the promise of escape. We burst from the crumbling doorway in a hail of eldritch shrieks, but the horrors kept coming, a tide of writhing, tattered flesh. Alvarez fished a grenade from his vest. "Get clear!" He yanked the pin and lobbed it back through the doorway. A muffled crump shook the stones, followed by keening wails. In the shocking silence that followed, we sprinted for the tree line. Behind us, the camp belched smoke, greasy flames beginning to lick at the eaves. Burning fish frog smell rolled over us, and I gagged. At the forest's edge, Alvarez grabbed my arm, pulling me up short. His face looked drawn and ashen. "This is so much worse than we thought. Did you see their altar? The symbols? This wasn't random. It was a ritual. They're trying to bring something through. I swallowed hard, the reality sinking in. The deep ones weren't just isolated monsters. There was an intelligence behind them, an agenda. And those murdered children had been mere sacrifices to fuel their nightmarish plans. We had to get this information back to command immediately, because if the horrors from the deeps gained a foothold in our world, nowhere would be safe. This was only the beginning. Major Briggs listened to our report with a hardening expression, his face etched with grim lines. When we finished, he steepled his fingers, gaze distant. "Deep ones," he said at last, voice heavy. "I'd hoped to never see them this far inland. This is deeply concerning." He turned to face us, eyes intense. "The symbols you described, the ritual killings, they're trying to open a deep gate, a portal to the abyssal plains, and I'm afraid they may have already succeeded." An involuntary shiver ran through me. I'd seen the mind-bending things that lurked in the spaces between worlds, the crawling chaos and forgotten gods. If the deep ones had opened a path for those horrors. Briggs called up a holographic map, zeroing in on a region in the mountains of North Carolina. "We've had strange reports coming out of the Pisgah-Nantahala wilderness. Seismic disturbances. Locals ranting about tentacled monstrosities glimpsed in the forests. I fear it may already be a beachhead." He fixed us with a look. "Alvarez, name. You two are the most experienced field agents we have with this particular threat. I need you on the ground immediately to assess the situation and lead the containment efforts. We cannot allow this incursion to spread." The weight of the task settled heavily on my shoulders, but I met the Major's eyes steadily. "We'll get it done, sir. One way or another, we'll drive them back." Alvarez nodded grimly at my side. "Time to finish this, before those abyssal bastards finish us." So once again we readied our gear and our minds to confront the horrors that lurked in the shadow spaces of our world. But this time, I feared that our resolve and our bullets might not be enough. The stakes had never been higher, and the nightmares had never been more real. Under cover of darkness, our helicopter set down in a remote stretch of the Appalachians, rotors whipping the trees. Above, stars glittered cold and sharp in a moonless sky. Stepping out into the night, I shivered at a palpable sense of oppressive menace. The air felt greasy, tainted. Our orders were to locate the epicenter of the disturbances and assess the threat level for reinforcements to move in. But as we fanned out into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late, that we were flies blundering into a spider's web. Alvarez took point, picking his way carefully through the undergrowth. I followed close on his heels, senses straining. Around us, the forest lay far too still and silent. No insect chorus, no owl cries, as if all the natural life had fled or been driven out. And then we smelled it on the wind, the acrid chemical reek of wrongness. It clawed at my sinuses and left an oily coating on my tongue. We exchanged a look, and I saw my own realization mirrored in Alvarez's eyes. That was the stink of an open hell portal, a wound in the skin of reality, leaking impossible emanations. Silently we crept forward, dread pressing in around us. The trees began to thin and the smell grew stronger, undercut now with the carrion feeder of death and decay. Ahead, the beam of Alvarez's flashlight speared a swirling wall of greasy mist. Eldritch shapes seemed to writhe in its depths. And then the screaming started. Shrill, gurgling cries ripped the night, agony and madness given voice. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, assaulting our ears. My heart kicked into panicked overdrive. I knew those sounds only too well. The shrieks of men and women being flensed of mind and body, being remade. The screams rose to a crescendo, rebounding off the hills, and then cut off abruptly. Echoes rang in the sudden, startling silence. Alvarez and I stood frozen, knuckles white on our guns. From the mist-shrouded gloom, the wet slap of flabby, dragging footsteps. A rank gust of air, heavy with the stench of low tide and putrefaction. The steps drew closer. Shapes moved in the fog. I drew a shaking breath, willing iron into my spine. Beside me, Alvarez braced to fire, and from the billowing banks of mist, our nightmares shambled forth to greet us with grasping arms and shrieking fang-filled maws. They came at us in a diseased tide, a mass of writhing, ichorous flesh and twisted limbs. Deep ones, their gelatinous bodies distorted into new and terrible configurations. Webbed hands sprouted long, scything claws, arms subdivided into thrashing tentacles. Lamprey mouths yawned in bellies, faces even embedded in broad, paddle-like tails, and ripped human bodies bobbed in their midst like obscene driftwood, the ravaged corpses of the swallowed expedition teams. Gutted torsos dangled from the grip of tentacles and claws, entrails trailing like grisly fronds. Pale, contorted faces stared in death, jaws frozen around silent screams. We opened fire, the night erupting into strobing muzzle flashes and deafening thunder. Our bullets plowed through pliant bodies, blasting fist-sized craters that wept black ichor. Alien screams rose in a deranged chorus, but for every abomination that fell twitching, 3 more boiled out of the mist. A massive specimen reared up over Alvarez, body glistening with mucus and eyes alight with malign intelligence. Claws shredded the air a hair's breadth from his face as he blasted it point-blank with his shotgun, shearing away a massive gobbet of membranous flesh. It shrieked and fell back only to be replaced by more grasping horrors. I fought at Alvarez's side, lashing out with gun and boot. My mind flashed to happier times than old, but those memories seemed to fray and splinter with each lurching horror I put down. This war, these nightmares, they hollowed out normalcy and left only the fight. Only the iron taste of blood and cordite, the scream of neurons and sinew pushed past breaking. The tide of horrors seemed endless, an inexorable wall of dank flesh pushing us back step by step. Fetid breath gusted over us, needle teeth gnashed and sought our flesh. We dumped the dregs of our ammunition into the mass to little avail. A searing pain lanced my thigh, a jagged gash weeping scarlet. A creature had slipped past my guard, ripping a line across my skin before I could blast it to rags. My leg buckled and I stumbled. A mossy boulder caught me, the impact driving the air from my lungs, and then they were on me. Suckered appendages coiled around my arms and throat, locking me in an implacable grip. I thrashed and kicked, but more tentacles snaked around my legs, my chest. My lungs burned and vision swam. This was it. This was the end. From my dimming periphery, a great roaring rose, and the pressure suddenly slackened. Great gouts of ichor splattered my face as Alvarez tore into my attackers with an impossibly huge knife, hacking and slashing with the ferocity of a berserker. He'd long since emptied his gun. With a cry of desperate strength, he hauled me up and we reeled away from the ravening horde. Straining lungs, burning muscles. We crashed heedlessly through the undergrowth as the writhing mass of flesh lurched after us. The tree line drew closer. If we could just reach open ground, call in fire support, maybe we could. The ground fell away before us. A great chasm yawned, overgrown with moss and choked with fog. The seismic disturbances Major Briggs had mentioned in our frantic flight, we'd run right up to the edge of the abyss. And from that abyss rose a sound that turned my blood to ice water in my veins. A deep, basso groaning, like the drumbeat of some colossal heart. Reality rippled around us, the fundamentals of natural law fraying at the edges. The trees, the stars themselves, seemed to flinch and wither. Slowly, terribly, we turned from the precipice to face the onrushing tide of horrors. And rising from their midst, a great figure reared high above the trees. Limbs like sinuous trunks unfolded from its body, itself a quivering mass shot through with luminous veins. Eyes the size of wrecking balls, pools of liquid madness, fixed on us with piercing malevolence. The grating bellow echoed from that titan's throat again, making our very bones shudder in sympathy. Half-formed and indistinct in the fog, it lurched forward on columnar legs, reaching for us with hands that could rend steel and stone. We stared up at the oncoming colossus, the smaller abominations capering in its wake. Empty guns dropped from nerveless fingers. There was nowhere left to run, no way to possibly fight the titan's crushing might. Our backup would never reach us in time. This was the end of our road, here in a remote forest, far from home, facing a monster that couldn't possibly be. I looked to Alvarez, and in his eyes, I saw the same grim resolve settle. If we were to die here, we would die fighting. My hand found his, and we gripped tight, united against the end. The Titan loomed, antediluvian and awful, blotting out the sky. Around us, the world continued to fray and distort as the very laws of nature unraveled. The abyss behind us groaned again, louder, a sound to shatter sanity. But as I braced for the bone-crushing impact of that great hand, I felt a sudden stillness descend. No fear, no pain, only the cold clarity of duty and the comforting pressure of Alvarez's fingers twined in mine. We had fought the good fight, stood against the rising dark longer than any could have asked. And if we couldn't stop the horrors this night, others would follow. I silently commended my spirit to whatever powers watched over those who stood against the abyss. And as the Titan's fist descended, I closed my eyes against the rushing dark and whispered my last prayer. Give us the strength to endure this night. And if the dawn never comes, let others' light shine on. The blow fell like an asteroid strike. Bones splintered, flesh ruptured. In an instant, all light and feeling fled. But as the crushing dark took me, I thought I glimpsed figures emerging from the fog behind the horde. The thump of rotors, shouted orders, muzzle flashes, and the crump of high explosives. Our backup had arrived at last. Too late for us, but maybe, just maybe, in time to turn the tide. Consciousness returned slowly, a gradual surfacing from the depths of oblivion. Light pried at my eyelids and I groaned, trying to turn away. Everything hurt. Stay still. You're safe now. A woman's voice, calm but firm. A hand rested on my shoulder. With effort, I cracked my eyes open. Sterile white walls, blurred shapes moving about. I lay in a hospital bed, swathed in bandages, and an IV line trailing from my arm. It all came rushing back. The mission, the horrors in the fog, Alvarez and I making our stand. Alvarez, I croaked through dry, cracked lips. Is he? In the next bed over. Banged up to hell and back like you, but he'll make it. The woman, a nurse, leaned into my field of vision. Stern but kind eyes met mine. You're damn lucky to be alive, both of you. The medevac team didn't think either of you had a pulse when they reached you. I struggled to process her words. We'd survived the Titan's blow? It seemed impossible, but the aches racking my body said otherwise. The nurse busied herself checking my vitals, making notes on a chart. Frankly, it's a miracle you boys held out as long as you did against those things. Bought just enough time for reinforcements to drop on that portal and collapse it with you two still breathing, but it was a close-run thing. I looked over to where Alvarez lay, still and pale against white sheets. Resolve settled in my chest, bringing with it a cold, still sort of calm. We'd faced the worst horrors imaginable, looked into the abyss and spat defiance with the deep ones, and worse things beside. As I slipped back toward unconsciousness, one thought crystallized in my mind, hard as diamond and sharp as a blade. For as long as I drew breath, I would stand against the rising tide of nightmares. No matter how dark the night grew, no matter what clawed its way out of the abyss, I would be there to meet it, to drive it back or die trying. Because in a world where the monsters under the bed turned out to be real, there was no other choice. We happy few, we band of brothers, we who fought the dying of the light. We were all that held the line, the nurse's voice echoed from 1,000 miles away. Rest now, you've earned it. The world will still be here when you wake up. The world, I rasped, but not unchanged. I held that thought as I spiraled back down into the waiting dark. Not unchanged, but still here, still fighting, and that would have to be enough. I knelt by the small, flower-strewn grave, fingers tracing the words carved into the headstone, so many names, etched in unyielding granite, the fallen from our unnamed war, those lost to the hungry dark. Months had passed since that last desperate battle in the North Carolina woods, months of recovery, of rebuilding. The doctors told me I shouldn't have survived, much less walk again. But I had promises to keep. Overhead, the sky hung gray and heavy. It seemed always on the verge of rain these days, the world grown dim. Reports trickled in from other teams, other operations, more portals, more abominations spewing forth. We were all that stood against the flood. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind me. A hand, strong and scarred, settled on my shoulder. I didn't need to look to know it was Alvarez. Command just called, he said quietly. They need us in Arizona. Possible deep one nest in the desert. Ritual killings. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that duty settle across my shoulders once more. How long do we have? Transport's spinning up now. I heard the grim smile in his voice. No rest for the wicked, yeah? No rest, I agreed. With a final touch to the memorial, I levered myself to my feet. The aches and pains were fewer every day, the scars fading, but some wounds would never fully heal. I turned to face my friend, my brother in arms. In his eyes I saw my own resolve, tempered in the flames of all we'd endured, all we'd lost. One last dance then, I said, once more unto the breach. Once more, he nodded, and then perhaps, one day, peace. I clasped his shoulder, a benediction and a promise. Peace, I echoed, when the task is done, when the dawn comes. He returned my grip fiercely. When the dawn comes, he agreed. And together we turned to walk back to the waiting world, to the duty that called us, the battle that never ended. For we were the watchmen on the walls, the line against the dark, we who fought monsters lest we become them, we who stood that others might sleep safe a while. It was a burden and an honor and a sacred charge, and one we would never lay down so long as strength and breath endured. We were headed back into the abyss, back to the teeth and the claws and the madness that lurked in the spaces between. But we did not go alone, and we did not go in fear, for ours was the fury, ours was the duty, ours was the dawn. The summer of 2019 was particularly scorching in northern Michigan, but that didn't deter our plans. Me and my three closest friends, Henry, Jasper, and Noah, had been planning this trip for months. Noah's father owned a remote hunting cabin about 30 miles from the nearest town, nestled deep in the densely wooded wilderness where cell reception was spotty at best and non-existent at worst. I was 32 that year, the oldest of our group by only a few months. We'd all been friends since college, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and an unspoken need to occasionally escape our increasingly demanding professional lives. This week-long retreat was meant to be restorative. Fishing, hiking, drinking beers around a fire, and reconnecting with both nature and each other. The drive up was filled with the usual banter and anticipation. We arrived at the dirt access road around noon, and from there it was another 45 minutes of bumpy driving before we reached the cabin itself. Home sweet home, Noah announced as we pulled into the small clearing. The cabin was rustic but solid, a two-bedroom structure built from weathered logs with a stone chimney rising from its center. A wide porch wrapped around the front, complete with a pair of rocking chairs that had seen better days. The surrounding forest was thick with towering pines and ancient oaks, their canopies creating a perpetual twilight even in the height of day. The air smelled of pine sap and rich soil, undisturbed by the pollution of the city. In the distance, I could hear the gentle babbling of the creek Noah had promised would be full of trout. "Your dad really knows how to pick 'em," I said, inhaling deeply as I stepped out of the car. "Can't even hear a highway from here." "That's the point," Noah replied, unloading supplies from the trunk. "Dad always said the further you get from other people, the closer you get to yourself." Henry chuckled, lighting a cigarette. "Or the closer you get to being eaten by bears." "The only predators around here are coyotes and the occasional mountain lion," Noah said with authority. "Nothing we can't handle." Jasper, always the most observant among us, was already surveying the tree line with interest. "There's a hunting platform in that oak," he noted, pointing to a sturdy-looking wooden structure about 15 feet up. "Is that your dad's?" Noah nodded. "Built it himself about 10 years ago. Great spot for deer hunting in the fall. You can see the whole eastern approach to the clearing from up there." We spent the next hour unloading our gear and settling into the cabin. Inside, it was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace and kitchenette, 2 bedrooms with bunk beds, and a small bathroom with running water courtesy of a well and generator setup. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself drawn to the windows, studying the dense wall of trees that surrounded us. Despite the warm welcome of sunshine and birdsong, I couldn't shake a peculiar sensation, as if the forest was studying us just as intently in return. "Who's up for some fishing?" Jasper asked around 3 o'clock, already assembling his rod. The temperature had climbed to nearly 90 degrees, and the prospect of cool creek water was appealing to all of us. The path to the creek wound through the forest for about a quarter mile, barely visible beneath the undergrowth. Noah led the way confidently, having visited many times before with his father. "Watch your step," he warned as we descended a steep embankment. "Some of these rocks get slick even in dry weather." The creek revealed itself suddenly, a 20-foot-wide ribbon of clear water cutting through the forest floor, bordered by smooth stones and small sandy beaches. Fallen logs created natural bridges at various points, and the water gurgled pleasantly as it navigated around them. "This is perfect," I said, already envisioning the trout that must be hiding in the deeper pools. We spread out along a 50-yard stretch, each claiming our own fishing spot. I found a promising location near a deeper pool where the water swirled lazily around a half-submerged log. The afternoon passed pleasantly, the four of us occasionally calling out when someone got a bite. I'd caught 2 modest-sized trout and was working on my third when Henry's voice cut through the forest sounds. "Guys, check this out!" We converged on his position downstream. Henry was pointing at something in the water near the opposite bank. As we focused, I could make out the distinctive pattern of a water snake, its body undulating gracefully against the current. "That's a northern water snake," Noah identified. "Non-venomous, but they'll still bite if you mess with them." The snake was nearly 3 feet long, its dark body marked with brown and reddish bands. It moved with surprising speed against the current, hunting for small fish or frogs. "Hold up," Jasper said, pulling out his phone to take a picture. "This'll make a great shot." What happened next occurred so quickly that we barely had time to process it. As Jasper raised his phone, a shadow passed overhead. There was a rush of air, a splash, and suddenly a red-tailed hawk was rising from the creek, the snake writhing in its powerful talons. "Holy!" Henry's exclamation was cut short as we watched the hawk ascend, the snake fighting desperately in its grasp. The violence of nature played out above us as the hawk adjusted its grip mid-flight, the snake's struggles growing weaker. Then both predator and prey disappeared over the tree line, leaving us in stunned silence. "Did you get that?" I asked Jasper. He nodded, reviewing the sequence on his phone. "Got the whole thing. That was intense." "Nature's brutal," Noah said quietly. "Dad always says we forget that when we're living in cities." The encounter left us subdued as we packed up our fishing gear. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, lengthening the shadows around us. It was time to head back and prepare dinner. As we gathered our things, I noticed something odd about the forest. The ambient sounds, the birds, insects, and rustling leaves, had diminished significantly. The woods had grown unnaturally quiet, as if holding its collective breath. "We should get back," I said, suddenly eager to return to the cabin's relative safety. "It'll be dark soon." The path back seemed different somehow, darker, more enclosed. I attributed it to the changing angle of the sun, but couldn't shake a growing unease. About halfway to the cabin, Noah stopped abruptly, causing me to nearly collide with him. "Look," he whispered, pointing to our right. Through the trees, perhaps 30 yards away, stood a deer. In Michigan, white-tailed deer are common enough, but my immediate impression was that something was off about this one. Even at a distance, it appeared unusually large. "That's a buck," Henry whispered. "Big one, too." As our eyes adjusted, I could make out more details. The deer was partially obscured by a large oak, but its head and neck were visible. What struck me was its posture. It wasn't grazing or moving, but standing perfectly still, its head turned directly toward us. "Is it just me, or is that thing watching us?" Jasper murmured. He was right. Unlike typical deer that bolt at the first sign of human presence, this one was deliberately observing us. Its head rose above the underbrush at a height that seemed impossible for a normal deer. "Noah," I said quietly, "how tall would you say that thing is?" Noah squinted. "It's hard to tell from here, but that oak it's standing behind is one I know well. If its head is where I think it is, that deer has to be at least 7 feet at the shoulder." "That's impossible," Henry scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. The deer continued to stare, unmoving. Then Henry, in a moment of either bravery or foolishness, stepped forward and made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, the kind you might use to call a dog. "Henry, what the hell?" I hissed. "It's not a freaking dog." "I just want to see what it does," he replied, making the sound again. The deer's response was subtle but unmistakable. Its head tilted slightly, an almost human gesture of curiosity. Then very deliberately it stepped backward, disappearing behind the tree. We waited for it to emerge on the other side, but it never did. "Let's keep moving," Noah said, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. No one argued. We continued toward the cabin at a quicker pace, each lost in thought. I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that we were being followed. The familiar outline of the cabin was a welcome sight as we emerged from the tree line. The building seemed somehow smaller and more vulnerable than it had earlier, dwarfed by the surrounding forest that now took on a more oppressive quality in the fading light. "I'll get the fire going," Noah announced, heading for the stone fire pit in front of the cabin. "We should cook those fish before they spoil." While Noah busied himself with the fire, Henry lit another cigarette and settled into one of the porch chairs. Jasper and I decided to pass the time with a little competition. "Bet I can stick this tomahawk in that dead pine over there," Jasper challenged, retrieving a small throwing axe from his bag. "You're on," I replied, grateful for the distraction. "Loser cooks dinner." The dead pine stood about 15 feet away, its bark gray and peeling. Jasper took the first throw, the tomahawk rotating once before striking the tree with a satisfying thunk, burying itself an inch deep. "Your turn," he grinned, retrieving the axe. Our competition continued as the sky darkened and Noah's fire grew stronger. The physical activity helped ease the tension that had built during our encounter in the forest, though I noticed we all frequently glanced toward the tree line. By the time the fire was properly blazing, Jasper had won our contest by 2 throws. "Hope you're ready to cook," he teased as I conceded defeat. The evening progressed pleasantly enough. We grilled the trout along with some hot dogs, cracked open beers, and tried to recapture our earlier enthusiasm for the trip. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, the fire became our center of gravity, its warm light creating a small circle of safety against the pressing blackness beyond. "So about that deer," Henry said after his first beer, voicing what we'd all been thinking about. "That was weird, right?" "Definitely not normal behavior," Noah agreed. "Deer don't typically stand their ground like that, especially not with 4 humans present." "Forget the behavior," Jasper interjected. "Did you see the size of it? I've been hunting since I was 12, and I've never seen a whitetail that big." Noah nodded solemnly. When it was standing behind that oak, its head was almost level with that broken branch. That would put it at the size of a large horse, maybe bigger. "Could it have been an elk?" I suggested, searching for a rational explanation. "They get pretty big." "No elk in this part of Michigan," Noah replied. "Not for decades." We fell silent, each contemplating the anomaly we'd witnessed. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. From somewhere deep in the forest came the haunting call of an owl. "My dad used to tell stories," Noah said finally, his voice low. "Old hunters' tales about strange things in these woods. I always thought they were just stories meant to keep me from wandering too far." "What kind of stories?" Henry asked, leaning forward. Noah shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. "Just old folklore. Every forest has them. Native American legends, settler superstitions, that sort of thing." "About deer?" Jasper pressed. "About things that use familiar shapes to hide their true nature," Noah replied cryptically. "Look, it was probably just an unusually large buck, maybe with some genetic mutation. Nothing supernatural." The conversation drifted to other topics after that, but an undercurrent of unease remained. None of us ventured far from the fire, and we all agreed to turn in relatively early. By midnight, we had doused the fire and retreated to the safety of the cabin, securing the door behind us. Sleep came surprisingly easy, despite the day's unsettling encounter. The physical exertion of fishing and the calming effect of a few beers likely contributed to my quick descent into unconsciousness. I was assigned one of the bottom bunks in the main bedroom, with Jasper above me and Noah and Henry in the second bedroom. I don't know how long I slept before the sound penetrated my dreams. At first, it incorporated itself into my subconscious, a distant calling that my dreaming mind attributed to someone shouting my name. But as consciousness gradually returned, the sound resolved into something else entirely. It was a buck call, the distinctive grunting sound male deer make during rutting season. Even in my groggy state, 2 things immediately struck me as wrong. It was June, not rutting season, and the sound was somehow distorted, deeper and more resonant than any deer call I'd ever heard. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The cabin was silent except for Jasper's steady breathing above me. The call came again, closer this time. It seemed to originate from just beyond the cabin walls, a low, guttural sound that bore only a passing resemblance to a normal deer vocalization. Carefully, I slipped from my bunk and moved to the window. The night was clear, moonlight bathing the clearing in a ghostly blue glow. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see nothing. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure. In the moonlight, its silhouette was unmistakable, the general shape of a deer, but wrong in fundamental ways. It stood upright on two legs, its proportions disturbingly human-like despite the distinctly cervine head. Even from a distance, I could see that its antlers were massive, extending outward and upward like gnarled branches. Fear cemented me in place as the creature took a deliberate step forward, then another, emerging fully from the tree line. Its movement was fluid yet unnatural, a bipedal gait that no deer should possess. As it approached the cabin, I shrank back from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. The creature stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, raised its head, and emitted that terrible approximation of a buck call again. Then it turned its head directly toward my window. I dropped to the floor, pressing my back against the wall beneath the window. Seconds stretched into an eternity as I fought to control my breathing, certain that any sound would betray my presence. The floorboards outside my window creaked. Something large was moving along the side of the cabin, its weight causing the old wood to protest. I remained frozen, listening to its progress until the sound stopped directly outside my window. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I slowly raised myself just enough to peer over the windowsill. The face that greeted me would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was, at first glance, the head of a white-tailed buck, but observed closely, the wrongness of it became apparent. The eyes were too forward-facing, too intelligent. The mouth, partially open as it exhaled cloudy breath against the glass, contained teeth that no herbivore should possess, sharp, almost canine in appearance. The creature's head nearly reached the top of the window, which I knew to be over 7 feet from the ground. Its antlers extended beyond, scraping softly against the cabin's wooden exterior. We stared at each other through the glass, separated by mere inches. Its eyes reflected the moonlight with an unnatural amber glow. There was intelligence in that gaze, a calculating awareness that sent waves of primal terror through my body. Then, ever so slowly, it raised one limb. Not a hoof, but something closer to a hand, with elongated fingers ending in dark, curved claws. It pressed this appendage against the glass as if testing its strength. I remained paralyzed, certain that any movement would provoke an attack. The creature continued its examination of the window, running its clawed hand along the frame, searching for weakness. Finding none, it lowered its appendage and took a step back. For a moment, I thought it was leaving. Instead, it tilted its head in that unsettlingly human manner, turned, and moved away from my window, heading toward the other side of the cabin, toward Henry and Noah's room. I don't know how long I remained frozen beneath the window. My mind raced with conflicting impulses: hide, warn my friends, find a weapon. Before I could decide on a course of action, a blood-curdling scream tore through the cabin. "Get away from me!" Henry's voice, pitched high with terror, galvanized me into action. I lurched to my feet as Jasper jolted awake above me. "What's happening?" he demanded, already scrambling down from his bunk. "Something's attacking Henry," I gasped, rushing toward the door. "The deer! It's not a deer!" We burst into the hallway just as Noah emerged from the second bedroom, shotgun in hand. "It was at the window," he said, his face pale in the dim light. Reaching inside, another scream from Henry propelled us into the bedroom. He was pressed against the far wall, his right arm clutched to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. "It had my arm," he choked out, tried to pull me through the window. The window beside his bunk was open several inches. Henry had always preferred fresh air while sleeping. Outside, we could hear heavy movement, branches snapping under substantial weight. "We need to close and lock every entrance," Noah commanded, taking charge. "Windows, doors, everything, now!" We moved with desperate efficiency, securing each potential entry point. As I rushed to lock the front door, a heavy impact shook the entire structure. Something large had slammed against the wall. "It's testing the cabin," Noah said grimly, checking the shotgun's chamber. "Looking for a way in." The distorted buck call sounded again, now directly outside the main room. It was followed by another impact, this one against the door. The wood creaked but held. "What the hell is that thing?" Jasper whispered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I don't know," Noah admitted, positioning himself in the center of the room with the shotgun raised. "But it's not leaving." The attacks continued, methodical and determined. The creature circled the cabin, testing each wall, window, and door. Occasionally, we caught glimpses of it through the windows, always that impossible silhouette, part deer, part man, wholly terrifying. Henry sat at the kitchen table, his wounded arm now bandaged with a torn t-shirt. The cuts were deep but had mostly stopped bleeding. "It had claws," he said dully, staring at nothing. "And fingers, like hands, but not hands." None of us knew how to respond to that. The siege continued for what felt like hours. The creature seemed tireless in its determination to find a way inside. We took turns watching the windows while Noah kept the shotgun trained on the most vulnerable points. "If it gets in," he said quietly during a momentary lull in the attacks, "aim for the chest. Even if it's not natural, it should still have vital organs." The implication hung heavy in the air. None of us had come on this trip expecting to fight for our lives. Around 3 a.m., the attacks suddenly ceased. The forest fell silent, not even the normal nocturnal sounds penetrating the quiet. We remained vigilant, certain it was a trick, a lull designed to lower our guard. "Do you think it's gone?" Jasper finally asked after 30 minutes of silence. "I'm not counting on it," Noah replied, his knuckles white around the shotgun. "But maybe it's regrouping, or hunting. Either way, we stay locked down until daylight." Dawn couldn't come fast enough. First light arrived with agonizing slowness. None of us had slept, our nerves frayed by the night's ordeal. As sunlight gradually filtered through the windows, we remained huddled in the main room, waiting for full daybreak before considering our next move. "I need to see outside," Noah finally said, as the sun cleared the eastern tree line. "We need to know what we're dealing with." With the shotgun at the ready, he cautiously approached the front window. The rest of us hung back, prepared to barricade ourselves in the bedrooms if necessary. "I don't see anything moving," Noah reported after scanning the clearing. "But there's evidence." "What kind of evidence?" I asked, dreading the answer. Noah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to each window methodically, surveying the area around the cabin. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "It's safe to go out," he announced finally. "At least I think it is, but you need to see this for yourselves." We carefully unbarricaded the front door. Noah exited first, shotgun raised, while the rest of us followed cautiously. The morning air was crisp and clean, belying the horror of the previous night. The damage to the cabin was immediately apparent. Deep gouges marked the walls where the creature had attacked, splintered wood hanging in strips. The front door showed significant damage, the frame partially separated from the wall. But it was the ground around the cabin that truly confirmed our encounter. Footprints circled the entire structure, not the typical cloven hoofprints of a deer, but something far more disturbing. They were larger than a man's foot, with a hybrid quality that defied easy description. The front portion resembled a hoof, but the rear splayed out into something almost hand-like, with distinct digit impressions. "These aren't deer tracks," Jasper stated the obvious, kneeling to examine one particularly clear impression. "Not bear or mountain lion either." "Look at the size," I added, placing my open hand next to one print. My entire hand fit easily within its perimeter. Noah had moved to examine the exterior wall beneath Henry's window. "There's blood here," he noted grimly, "and hair caught in the wood." We gathered around. Snagged in the splintered siding were several coarse hairs, too long and thick for a deer, more similar to human hair but with an unusual reddish-brown coloration. "There's something else," Noah said, his voice strained. He pointed upward. On the cabin's roof lay the carcass of a deer, a young doe, its body broken and mangled. But it wasn't the dead animal itself that caused us to recoil in horror. It was the manner of its demise. The doe's chest cavity had been torn open, ribs splayed outward, its heart and liver conspicuously absent. "It was feeding," Henry whispered, clutching his bandaged arm tighter, like it was leaving us a message. No one disputed his interpretation. Our examination continued with growing dread. The creature had circled the cabin dozens of times during the night, its tracks indicating a methodical search for entry points. In some places, the ground was torn up where it had apparently stood in place, possibly listening or planning its next move. "We need to leave," I said finally, voicing what we were all thinking. "Now. Today." No one argued. We returned to the cabin and began packing with urgent efficiency, each of us processing the impossible evidence we'd witnessed. The previous night, fear and darkness had allowed for potential misinterpretation. But in the clear light of day, the reality was undeniable. We had encountered something that should not exist. We were packed and ready to depart within 30 minutes. Noah insisted on taking photos of the evidence, the tracks, claw marks, and even, reluctantly, the mutilated doe on the roof. "For my father," he explained. "He needs to know what's happening here." The drive out of the forest was tense, each of us starting at shadows among the trees. I took the wheel, Noah riding shotgun with his actual shotgun across his lap. Henry and Jasper sat in the back, scanning the forest on either side of the narrow access road. "What do you think it was?" Jasper finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. No one answered immediately. The question demanded acknowledgement of something beyond our understanding of the natural world. "My grandfather used to tell stories," Noah said eventually, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "He was half Ojibwe, said these forests have always had guardians, spirits that protect the land from those who would harm it." "We weren't harming anything," Henry protested, his voice hoarse. "Some of the stories weren't about protection," Noah continued. "Some were warnings about things that had changed, corrupted, things that started as one creature but became something else." The implication hung in the air as we continued our slow progress toward the main road. When we finally reached the highway, the relief was palpable, as if we'd crossed an invisible boundary beyond which normal rules of reality were restored. We stopped at a diner in the nearest town, each ordering coffee more for the comfort of normality than actual thirst. We agreed on a story for Henry's arm, a fishing accident, a hook gone astray, before seeking medical attention at the local clinic. The doctor who treated Henry's wound frowned at the jagged tears. "This doesn't look like any fishing injury I've seen," she remarked, but didn't press the issue when we maintained our story. The long drive home was subdued. We tried discussing what had happened, attempting to rationalize our experience, but the conversation inevitably circled back to the undeniable evidence of our senses. "Maybe it was some kind of mutation," Jasper suggested. "Radiation or chemical contamination could cause deformities." "Deformities don't explain intelligence," I countered. "That thing was hunting us deliberately. It was thinking." In the weeks that followed, we struggled to readjust to normal life. I found myself startling at unexpected movements glimpsed from the corner of my eye. Shadows took on threatening dimensions. Sleep became elusive, my dreams plagued by antlered silhouettes and amber eyes. Noah contacted his father about the incident. The older man visited the cabin himself, returning with troubling reports of more tracks, more signs of the creature's presence. He closed up the property indefinitely. Henry was the most affected. The physical wounds healed, leaving 3 parallel scars along his forearm, but the psychological damage ran deeper. He developed a pathological fear of forests and would cross the street to avoid even ornamental deer statues. The medication his therapist prescribed helped with the anxiety, but couldn't erase the memory. Jasper and Noah returned to the area once, a year later, during daylight hours and heavily armed. They didn't stay overnight but reported finding more evidence: deer carcasses with surgical precision to the wounds, unusual tracks, and a crude structure of branches high in the trees that resembled no known animal nest. As for me, I've never returned. I can't. The rational part of my mind has constructed various explanations over the years: a deformed predator, perhaps a bear with genetic abnormalities, or even a human psychopath using animal disguise to terrorize intruders. But in my heart, I know the truth. There are things in this world that exist in the boundaries between classification, things that defy our comfortable categorizations. Things that watch and wait in the ancient forests, wearing familiar shapes that disguise their true nature. I still fish and occasionally camp, but only in open spaces where visibility extends in all directions. I never venture into dense forests anymore, especially not as daylight wanes. And I never, under any circumstances, approach deer that stand their ground when humans appear. Some nights, when the wind blows from the north carrying the scent of pine and earth, I find myself checking the locks on my doors and windows. I draw the curtains tight and turn up the television to drown out any sounds from outside. Because deep down, I know that what we encountered wasn't confined to those woods. It's still out there, watching, waiting, and I can't escape the terrible certainty that someday, somehow, I'll look up to find those amber eyes staring at me through a window once again. The gravel crunched beneath our boots as we made our way down the winding trail toward Cabin 7. November 2019 had brought an early frost to the Adirondack Mountains, and the bare branches overhead created a skeletal canopy against the gray afternoon sky. My 18-year-old daughter Megan walked beside me, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as she took in her first glimpse of the remote camp that had been part of my life for over 3 decades. "It's really isolated out here, Dad," she said, adjusting her backpack straps as we navigated around a fallen branch that had partially blocked the narrow path. I nodded, remembering my own first impression of this place back in 1987 when I was just a college freshman. The camp, owned by my alma mater, consisted of 10 rustic cabins scattered throughout nearly 200 acres of pristine wilderness. Each structure was positioned strategically to provide maximum privacy, connected only by a network of hiking trails that meandered through towering pines and hardwood groves. The quarter-mile walk from the parking area felt longer than usual, weighed down as we were with supplies for our 3-day retreat. I had specifically requested Cabin 7 because it sat in what the camp staff called the glade, a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks that created a natural amphitheater of sorts. A thin walking path continued past the cabin's front porch, eventually leading to the more remote cabins deeper in the woods. As we approached our destination, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always accompanied my arrival here. The cabin's rustic construction was a testament to early American craftsmanship. Massive logs hewn directly from the surrounding forest, fitted together with such precision that they had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. The structure seemed to grow organically from the forest floor, as if it had always been part of this landscape. "Wow, it really is like stepping back in time," Megan observed, running her hand along the smooth surface of one of the porch support posts. The covered porch stretched across the entire front of the cabin, its wooden railing weathered to a silvery gray. Built into the left side of the railing was a sturdy wood rack, constructed of thick horizontal slats designed to hold split logs off the ground. I fished the old brass key from my jacket pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked as it swung open, releasing the familiar scent of aged wood and cold ash from the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room. The interior was spartanly furnished, but comfortable. 2 well-worn leather couches arranged around the hearth, a solid oak dining table, and a galley kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. "No electricity?" Megan asked, noting the absence of light switches or outlets. "Propane lanterns only," I confirmed, pointing to the brass fixtures mounted on the log walls. "And no running water either. See that blue container by the sink? That's our water supply for the next 3 days." She examined the 10-gallon plastic jug positioned to the left of the simple porcelain sink, which was set into a wooden counter against the far wall. The primitive conditions were part of the camp's charm, designed to encourage disconnection from the modern world and reconnection with simpler pleasures. Behind the main room, a narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms, each furnished identically with twin beds positioned against opposite walls and a single window centered between them. The beds were covered with thick wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar from the storage chests where they spent the off-season. "I call the left bed," Megan announced, dropping her duffel bag on the mattress nearest the exterior wall. "Works for me," I replied, though I couldn't shake a vague uneasiness about her choice. The window between our beds looked out into dense forest, where the last rays of afternoon sunlight were already beginning to fade between the tree trunks. We spent the next hour unloading our supplies and settling in. I showed Megan how to operate the propane lanterns and explained the quirks of the old wood-burning stove in the kitchen. By the time we had finished organizing our gear, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. "Time to earn our warmth," I announced, grabbing the splitting axe from its hook beside the back door. One of the camp traditions is that every guest splits their own firewood. Good exercise and guarantees you'll appreciate the heat. Outside, a neat pile of seasoned logs waited beside the chopping block, positioned about 50 yards behind the cabin. The wood had been cut from trees that had fallen naturally in recent storms, part of the camp's sustainable forestry practices. As we worked, taking turns with the heavy axe, I found myself frequently glancing toward the tree line. The forest seemed unusually quiet for this time of day, lacking the typical sounds of small animals foraging for winter provisions. Megan proved surprisingly adept with the axe, her college softball training evident in her smooth, powerful swing. Within 30 minutes, we had accumulated enough split wood to last through the cold night ahead, plus extra for the following day. As we carried armloads of the fragrant pine and oak back to the cabin, the sun finally disappeared behind the western ridgeline, plunging the glade into premature twilight. Loading the wood onto the stone hearth inside, I built our first fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. The kindling caught quickly, followed by progressively larger pieces, until flames danced cheerfully in the firebox. We arranged the excess wood in the rack on the porch, stacking it carefully to promote air circulation and prevent moisture buildup. By the time we had finished our preparations, full darkness had settled over the camp. The only illumination came from our fire and the soft glow of a single propane lantern I had lit above the kitchen counter. Outside, the November night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the temperature continued its steady descent toward what the weather forecast had predicted would be a record-breaking low for this date. "I can see why you love it here," Megan said as we settled onto one of the couches I had turned to face the fireplace. "It's like the rest of the world doesn't exist." I nodded, opening the paperback novel I had brought for the trip. The isolation was indeed one of the camp's greatest attractions. No cell phone service, no internet, no distractions from the constant connectivity that defined modern life. Here, time moved at the pace of burning logs and turning pages, measured by the gradual accumulation of glowing coals rather than digital clocks. We cooked our dinner on the wood stove, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that tasted infinitely better in this setting than it would have in any restaurant. The only sounds were the crackling of burning wood and the occasional settling creaks of the old cabin, adjusting to the dropping temperature. Even the wind had died away, leaving us in a bubble of perfect silence. As we cleaned up after dinner, I caught myself listening for sounds from outside, not from any sense of danger, but from long habit. In 30 years of visits to this camp, I had heard every variety of night sound these mountains could produce. The haunting calls of loons from distant lakes, the rustle of deer moving through underbrush, the sharp crack of branches breaking under the weight of snow or ice. Tonight, however, the forest remained eerily quiet, as if every living creature had decided to remain hidden. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The combination of crisp mountain air, physical exertion from splitting wood, and the hypnotic warmth of the dying fire created perfect conditions for deep, dreamless rest. I woke naturally as pale dawn light filtered through the frost-covered windows, feeling refreshed and eager to share this special place with my daughter. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped considerably during the night. I could see my breath clearly as I quietly rebuilt the fire from the cold ashes. The ritual of coaxing flames back to life from buried embers always gave me a sense of primitive satisfaction, connecting me to generations of humans who had performed this same essential task. Megan emerged from the bedroom as the coffee began percolating on the wood stove, her hair tousled and her cheeks pink from the cold. "I can't believe how quiet it was," she said, wrapping herself in one of the wool blankets from her bed. "I usually need some kind of background noise to fall asleep, but last night was different. The silence was almost comfortable." After a hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon cooked on the old cast-iron stove, we set out to explore the broader camp property. I wanted to show Megan some of the other cabins where I had stayed over the years, each with its own character and history. The morning air was sharp and clean, scented with pine resin and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. We hiked the main trail that connected all 10 cabins, stopping to examine the architectural details that made each structure unique. Cabin 3, where I had stayed during my honeymoon 25 years earlier, featured an elaborate stone chimney decorated with fossils found on the property. Cabin 9, perched on a small bluff overlooking a beaver pond, had been built entirely from American chestnut logs, now an impossibly rare and valuable wood. The clouds had thickened during our walk, and by the time we returned to Cabin 7 around noon, a light drizzle had begun to fall. I quickly rebuilt our fire while Megan prepared sandwiches for lunch. The cabin felt wonderfully cozy as we settled back onto the couch with our simple meal, listening to the gentle patter of raindrops on the roof. "I understand now why you've been coming here for so long," Megan said, curling up in the corner of the couch with her book. "There's something almost addictive about the simplicity. No decisions to make, except when to add wood to the fire and what to read next." I smiled, remembering my own first experience of this place and how it had instantly become a refuge from the complexities of academic life. Over the decades, I had brought roommates, girlfriends, and eventually my wife to this camp. Megan was the first of my children to show interest in joining me, and I was grateful she seemed to appreciate what made this place special. We spent the afternoon reading in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on our books or feeding another log to the fire. The rain continued steadily but gently, creating a soothing background rhythm that made the warm interior feel even more welcoming. Every so often, I would glance up from my pages to watch my daughter, noting how the firelight softened her features and gave her an almost timeless appearance. She could have been any young woman from any era, seeking solace and wisdom in the pages of a book beside a warming fire. As evening approached, the rain tapered off, leaving the forest glistening with moisture. I lit several of the wall-mounted propane lanterns, casting a warm, steady glow throughout the main room. We prepared a more elaborate dinner than the previous night. Pasta with meat sauce, garlic bread warmed on the wood stove, and a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. "To new traditions," I toasted as we sat down at the oak table. "To new traditions," Megan agreed, clinking her glass against mine. The meal was leisurely and conversation flowed easily between us. We talked about her plans after college graduation, my memories of my own early career, and the changes we had both noticed in the world over the past few years. The wine and warmth of the cabin created an atmosphere of intimate honesty that rarely occurred in our normal daily interactions. As we cleaned up after dinner, I found myself feeling genuinely content. This trip was accomplishing exactly what I had hoped, providing quality time with my daughter while introducing her to a place that had shaped so many of my most treasured memories. The rain had stopped completely, and through the windows I could see stars beginning to appear between the dispersing clouds. "Perfect timing," I observed, nodding toward the clearing sky. "Tomorrow should be ideal hiking weather." Megan yawned and stretched, the combination of fresh air, wine, and the hypnotic warmth of the fire making her drowsy. "I think I'm ready for bed," she announced. "That mountain air really takes it out of you." I banked the fire carefully, ensuring enough coals would survive to make morning fire starting easier, and followed her toward the bedrooms. As I prepared for sleep, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how the trip was progressing. Megan seemed genuinely enchanted with the camp, and we were building exactly the kind of shared experience I had hoped for. Outside, the forest had returned to its profound nighttime quiet. No wind stirred the branches, no animals called to each other across the darkness. The silence was so complete it seemed almost solid, wrapping around the cabin like a protective blanket. As I drifted toward sleep, I remember thinking that this might be one of the most peaceful places left on Earth. I was completely unprepared for what the next day would bring. The second day dawned crisp and clear, with brilliant sunshine streaming through windows still etched with delicate frost patterns. I woke feeling energized and optimistic, eager to continue showing Megan the hidden treasures of the camp property. After rebuilding the fire and starting coffee, I stepped onto the front porch to assess the weather conditions for our planned longer hike. The air was so clean and sharp it seemed to cut into my lungs with each breath. Every detail of the surrounding forest stood out with startling clarity. Individual needles on the pine boughs, the intricate patterns of bark on the oak trees, the crystalline droplets of moisture still clinging to spider webs stretched between branches. It was the kind of perfect autumn morning that makes you grateful to be alive and aware. Megan emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her cheeks already pink from the cold air. "It's like a postcard out here," she said, handing me one of the cups and settling onto the porch railing beside me. We spent a pleasant hour planning our day's adventure over breakfast, studying the hand-drawn trail map that had been left in the cabin by previous guests. I wanted to show her the old fire tower on the property's highest peak, a remnant from the days when forest fires posed a constant threat to these mountains. The hike would take most of the morning, but the views from the top were spectacular on a clear day like this. By mid-morning, we had packed day packs with water and snacks and set out on the trail that wound up the mountainside behind the cabin. The path was well maintained but challenging, climbing steadily through groves of birch and maple trees that had dropped their leaves to create a thick golden carpet beneath our feet. Megan proved to be an excellent hiking companion, maintaining a steady pace while pointing out interesting rock formations and wildlife signs along the way. The fire tower, when we finally reached it after 2 hours of climbing, was even more impressive than I had remembered. Built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the steel structure rose 60 feet above the tree line, offering panoramic views of the entire Adirondack region. We climbed the metal stairs to the observation platform, where a rusty logbook invited visitors to record their impressions. "This is incredible," Megan breathed, slowly turning to take in the 360-degree vista of mountains, lakes, and forest stretching to the horizon in every direction. I had no idea the camp was situated in such spectacular country. I pointed out various landmarks visible from our elevated perch, the lake where I had learned to canoe as a college student, the ridgeline that marked the boundary of the state park, the distant peaks where serious mountaineers tested their skills against some of the Northeast's most challenging climbs. For nearly an hour we remained on the platform, sharing stories and simply absorbing the magnificent scenery. The hike back down to Cabin 7 took less time than the ascent, but our legs were definitely feeling the effects of the morning's exertion by the time we reached the familiar clearing. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the air considerably, and we were both grateful to settle onto the front porch for a rest before preparing lunch. When we both heard it. The sound came from directly behind us, outside the cabin, but very close. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A rolling, rumbling noise that seemed to move from left to right across what I knew had to be the front porch. My first thought was that one of the logs from the wood rack had somehow shifted and rolled across the wooden decking. But something about the sound felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too controlled to be a simple case of gravity acting on an unstable piece of firewood. Megan and I locked eyes immediately, both of us frozen in position on the couch. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though her expression made the question unnecessary. "Yes," she whispered, "but it sounded like it came from back there." She pointed toward the rear of the cabin, which confused me because I was certain the sound had originated from the front porch area. I stood up slowly, my heart rate accelerating as I tried to process what we had just experienced. In all my years of visiting this camp, I had become familiar with every sound the forest could produce. Falling branches, small animals scurrying through underbrush, the occasional larger mammal moving through the vicinity. This sound was different. It had an intentional quality that suggested intelligence behind it. "Probably just some other guests walking along the trail," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. The rolling sound hadn't been footsteps, and it had come from the porch itself, not the walking path that passed 15 feet away from the cabin's front steps. I moved to the window and peered out toward the trail, expecting to see hikers or perhaps some of the camp maintenance staff making their rounds. The forest was completely empty. No movement, no signs of human presence, no indication that anyone else was anywhere in the vicinity. Returning to where Megan sat, I could see fear beginning to creep into her expression. Her book lay forgotten in her lap, and her eyes had taken on a wide, alert quality that reminded me of how deer look when they sense a predator nearby. "I better take a look outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and reassuring. The last thing I wanted was for this incident to ruin what had been a perfect trip so far. I walked to the hearth and selected a piece of split wood about 3 feet long. Not quite a weapon, but something solid I could swing if the situation required it. The weight of the hardwood in my hands provided a small measure of comfort as I approached the front door. "I'll be right back," I told Megan, though I noticed my voice sounded less confident than I had intended. The brass doorknob felt cold under my palm as I turned it slowly, listening for any sounds from the other side. The hinges creaked as I opened the door just wide enough to slip through, then closed it behind me with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stood on the threshold for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the bright sunlight after the relative dimness of the cabin interior. Every detail of the porch appeared exactly as it should. The wood rack still neatly stacked with split logs, the railing showing its normal pattern of weathered wood grain, the decking clean except for a few scattered leaves that had fallen during our morning hike. Taking 2 deliberate steps onto the porch proper, I turned first to my left, scanning the area where the trail emerged from the forest. Nothing moved among the trees, and I could see far enough along the path to confirm that no other hikers were approaching or departing. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I turned to the right, toward the wood rack where I believed the sound had originated. What I saw in that moment changed everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality. Hovering approximately 3 feet above the carefully stacked logs in the wood rack was something that defied every category my rational mind tried to impose upon it. At first glance, it resembled a tentacle from some massive sea creature, thick as my forearm at the base, tapering to a more slender tip, perhaps 4 feet in length overall. But this was no marine animal displaced to an Adirondack forest. The surface appeared to be a mottled light brown color marked with irregular white spots, while the underside showed a pale, almost translucent quality. Most unsettling of all, the entire form seemed to shift and shimmer as I stared at it, as if it existed only partially in the physical world I recognized. It possessed a luminous quality that reminded me of heat mirages rising from summer pavement, but far more substantial and purposeful. The moment my eyes fully focused on this impossible apparition, it reacted to my presence with startling intelligence. The appendage quickly withdrew, pulling back around the corner of the cabin with smooth, fluid motion that suggested complete awareness of being observed. There was nothing random or instinctive about its movement. This thing had been watching me just as intently as I was now watching it. What happened next taught me the true meaning of paralyzing terror. I had always been somewhat skeptical when reading accounts of people who claimed to be frozen with fear, assuming it was simply a dramatic exaggeration. Now I understood that it was a literal physiological response. Every muscle in my body locked simultaneously, as if my nervous system had simply stopped communicating with my limbs. My brain continued functioning normally, racing through possible explanations and screaming at my body to move, to investigate, to do something other than stand there like a statue. But my feet might as well have been nailed to the wooden porch decking. The split log I had brought for protection hung useless in my grip, my arm too rigid to raise it even if I had wanted to. The rational part of my mind desperately sought conventional explanations. Could it have been some kind of atmospheric phenomenon? Perhaps heat distortion from the warming day creating optical illusions? Might it have been an unusually large snake, though no serpent species in this region grew to such proportions or possessed that particular coloration? Was there any possibility of an elaborate prank being perpetrated by other camp guests, though the technology required for such a hoax seemed far beyond anything readily available? None of these explanations felt adequate to what I had witnessed. The thing I had seen possessed a quality of undeniable presence, a substance that transcended any trick of light or shadow. It had moved with purpose and intelligence, responding to my appearance with what could only be described as conscious intent. Time seemed suspended as I stood there, locked in place by a primal fear that bypassed all rational thought. It might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. My perception had become so distorted that I lost all sense of duration. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart, which seemed loud enough to echo off the surrounding trees. Gradually, as if emerging from some kind of hypnotic trance, I began to regain control over my body. The paralysis released slowly, starting with my fingers and working outward until I could once again move my arms and shift my weight from foot to foot. The relief of restored mobility was overwhelming, but it brought with it an even stronger urge to flee back to the safety of the cabin's interior. My first instinct was to retreat immediately, to put the solid walls of the cabin between myself and whatever I had encountered. But another part of my mind, the part trained by decades of academic inquiry to seek evidence and verify observations, insisted that I needed to investigate further. If I ran now without examining the scene, I would spend the rest of my life wondering if I had imagined the entire incident, fighting against every survival instinct screaming at me to escape. I forced myself to walk toward the corner of the porch where the apparition had vanished. Each step required enormous effort, as if I were moving through thick mud rather than empty air. My hands trembled as I gripped the porch railing for support, and cold sweat had begun forming on my forehead despite the warm afternoon sunshine. When I reached the corner and peered around the edge of the cabin, I found exactly what I had expected and dreaded. Nothing. No trace of the impossible thing I had witnessed. No evidence that anything unusual had occurred in this spot. The ground beneath, where it had hovered, showed no impressions, no disturbances in the thick layer of fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. I knelt down and examined the area more carefully, looking for any physical signs that might explain what I had seen. The earth beneath the wood rack was soft with recent moisture, perfect for preserving footprints or other marks. If a person had been standing here playing some kind of elaborate trick, there should have been clear evidence of their presence. Instead, I found only the natural accumulation of twigs, leaves, and forest debris that covered every square inch of the woodland floor. Standing up, I noticed something that sent another chill through my already agitated nervous system. Scattered around the base of the wood rack were numerous small branches and twigs that would have made any approach by a human being audibly obvious. Anyone walking through this area would have created a symphony of snapping and crackling sounds that I certainly would have heard from inside the cabin. Yet the rolling sound that had drawn my attention had been completely isolated, no accompanying footsteps or rustling vegetation. This observation forced me to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. Whatever I had seen could not have been produced by any conventional human presence. The physical evidence simply didn't support that explanation, leaving me to grapple with possibilities that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. Knowing that I needed to conduct a thorough examination of the entire area before returning to face my daughter's questions, I began a systematic circuit of the cabin's perimeter. My academic training and research methodology proved useful even in this bizarre situation. I would document everything I found, or more importantly, everything I didn't find. Starting from the front porch, I moved clockwise around the structure, examining every square foot of ground for any evidence of human intrusion. The cabin sat in a roughly circular clearing, about 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by dense forest that would make silent approach nearly impossible. Any person attempting to reach the building without using the established trail would have had to push through thick underbrush, inevitably leaving a trail of broken vegetation and disturbed earth. The soft soil around the cabin's foundation showed only the expected impressions: my own footprints from our wood-splitting activity the previous day, Megan's smaller tracks from when she had explored the area that morning, and the occasional paw prints of small woodland creatures going about their normal business. There were no human footprints other than our own. No trampled vegetation, no broken branches that might indicate someone had been lurking in the vicinity. As I completed my circuit and returned to the front porch, I felt a growing sense of unreality about the entire situation. The evidence clearly indicated that no other person had been near the cabin, yet I had undeniably witnessed something that appeared to possess intelligence and intent. The logical contradiction was maddening. My eyes and my scientific training were presenting me with incompatible conclusions. I climbed the steps back onto the porch and stood for a moment in the exact spot where I had first seen the apparition. In the bright afternoon sunlight, with birds beginning to resume their normal activities in the surrounding trees, the entire incident seemed almost dreamlike. Had I really seen what I thought I had seen? Could stress, altitude, or some other factor have caused a hallucination so vivid and detailed? But even as I tried to rationalize the experience, I couldn't shake the memory of how real it had appeared, how purposefully it had moved, how intelligently it had responded to my presence. Whatever I had witnessed possessed a quality of undeniable authenticity that no amount of logical analysis could dismiss. Taking a deep breath to compose myself, I opened the cabin door and stepped back inside. Megan was still sitting on the couch, but her posture had changed dramatically. Where before she had been relaxed and comfortable, Now she sat rigidly upright, her book closed and forgotten beside her, her eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that told me she was reading every detail of my expression for clues about what I had discovered. "Well?" she asked, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Did you find anything?" I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, trying to decide how much to tell her. The last thing I wanted was to frighten her unnecessarily, but I also couldn't simply pretend that nothing had happened. She had heard the same sound I had, and my extended absence had clearly given her time to work herself into a state of considerable anxiety. "I saw something," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "Something unusual." Her eyes widened and she leaned forward on the couch. "What kind of something?" I moved to the window and looked out toward the wood rack, half expecting to see the apparition materialize again in broad daylight. The porch appeared completely normal, with afternoon sunlight casting familiar shadows through the surrounding trees. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, turning back to face her. It was unlike anything I've ever seen before. It appeared to be floating above the wood rack, and when it noticed me watching, it disappeared around the corner of the cabin. "Floating?" Megan's voice cracked slightly on the word. I nodded, still holding the piece of split wood I had carried outside for protection. I was unconsciously tapping it against my leg, a nervous habit that I only became aware of when I saw her eyes tracking the movement. When I went around to investigate, there was no sign of anything. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate that anyone else has been near the cabin. Megan absorbed this information in silence for several long moments. I could see her mind working, trying to process the implications of what I was telling her. Finally, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Do you think we should leave?" The question forced me to confront my own feelings about what had occurred. My first instinct was indeed to pack up immediately and retreat to the safety of civilization. Every primitive survival mechanism in my brain was screaming at me to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part of me, the rational, educated part that had spent decades teaching students to think critically about unusual phenomena, was reluctant to abandon our trip based on a single unexplained incident. "I don't think we're in any immediate danger," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced of this myself. Whatever I saw didn't seem aggressive or threatening. If it meant us harm, it would have had ample opportunity to act when I was standing right there. This reasoning seemed to provide some comfort to both of us, though I noticed that Megan remained tense and alert as we settled back onto the couch. I added several logs to the fire, partly for warmth, but mostly because the familiar activity helped calm my nerves. The routine task of feeding flames and arranging burning wood provided a welcome anchor to normalcy after the surreal events of the afternoon. We spent the remainder of the daylight hours in a state of heightened awareness, both of us listening carefully to every sound from outside the cabin, every creak of settling wood, every rustle of wind through the trees, every distant bird call received our immediate attention. The peaceful sanctuary that the cabin had represented just hours earlier now felt like a vulnerable outpost surrounded by unknown threats. As evening approached and I began lighting the propane lanterns, I found myself frequently glancing toward the windows, checking for any signs of movement in the gathering dusk. The darkness that had seemed so welcoming on our first night now felt ominous and full of unseen possibilities. As twilight settled over the forest and the interior of the cabin took on the warm, flickering glow of lantern light, I attempted to restore some sense of normalcy by preparing dinner. Cooking had always been a meditative activity for me, requiring just enough concentration to quiet an overactive mind while producing tangible, comforting results. "Why don't you keep reading while I get our meal started?" I suggested to Megan, who had been casting nervous glances toward the windows every few minutes. "I'm making that pasta dish you liked so much last time I cooked it at home." She nodded gratefully and reopened her book, though I noticed her eyes rarely remained focused on the pages for more than a few seconds before darting back to the darkening windows. The normalcy I was trying to create felt fragile and artificial, like a thin veneer covering the underlying tension that had gripped us both since the afternoon's incident. I began by clearing the dishes we had left in the drying rack beside the sink from our hasty breakfast that morning. The simple ceramic plates and cups had been provided by the camp, sturdy, utilitarian pieces that had undoubtedly served hundreds of guests over the years. As I transferred them to their proper storage locations in the cabinets above the counter, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A large puddle of water had formed on the counter to the right of the sink, covering an area roughly the size of a dinner plate. The water was clear and odorless, appearing to be the same as what we had been using from our storage container. But the container itself sat on the opposite side of the sink, and I was certain the counter had been completely dry when we had left for our morning hike. I called Megan over to examine the mysterious puddle, hoping she might have some explanation for its presence. She studied the area carefully, running her finger through the water to test its properties, but appeared as puzzled as I was. "Could it have dripped from somewhere?" she asked, looking up toward the ceiling above the counter. I had already considered this possibility and grabbed a flashlight to conduct a thorough examination of the area above where the water had appeared. The log ceiling showed no signs of moisture, staining, or any other indication that water might have leaked through from outside. Moreover, the cabin's roof was steeply pitched, specifically to shed precipitation quickly, making it highly unlikely that standing water could accumulate anywhere above the interior spaces. "There hasn't been any rain since early this morning," I pointed out, "and even if there had been, I don't see any way water could get through that roof." We checked the plastic water container for leaks, examining every inch of its surface and the area where it connected to the simple spigot near the sink. Everything appeared to be in perfect working order, with no signs of dripping or seepage. The mystery deepened when I realized that even if the container had been leaking, the water would have pooled directly beneath it rather than across the counter in the opposite direction. I mopped up the puddle with a kitchen towel and dismissed the incident as an unexplained oddity. Perhaps a previous guest had left wet dishes in that area, or maybe I had splashed water there myself without noticing. Though neither explanation felt entirely satisfactory, I was reluctant to assign sinister significance to every unusual occurrence. Opening the cardboard boxes of dry goods we had stored on the small table against the far wall, I reached for a package of pasta and immediately noticed that it felt wrong in my hands. Instead of the crisp, dry cardboard I expected, the box felt soft and damp, as if it had been soaked in water and was only now beginning to dry out. "Megan, come look at this," I called, holding up the soggy package. She examined the pasta box and then checked the others stored on the same table. Every single item, crackers, cereal, instant oatmeal, tea bags, showed signs of having been thoroughly saturated with water. The cardboard containers were all soft and discolored, with watermarks that indicated they had been sitting in standing liquid for some extended period. Beneath the boxes, the wooden table surface showed a large water stain that was still damp to the touch. The stain covered nearly the entire tabletop, as if someone had poured several gallons of water directly onto the surface and left it to soak into the wood. This discovery was far more disturbing than the puddle by the sink because it couldn't be explained by any conventional means. The table sat in the middle of the cabin's interior, well away from any potential source of water. There were no pipes, no fixtures, no windows directly above the area. Even if the roof had somehow leaked, which our examination had ruled out, water would have had to defy gravity to reach this location. "This doesn't make sense," Megan said, voicing what we were both thinking. "How did all this water get here?" I didn't have an answer for her. The physical evidence was undeniable. Our food supplies had been soaked while we were away from the cabin, but there was no rational explanation for how it could have happened. We checked every possible source of water in the cabin's interior, from the storage container to the primitive plumbing fixtures, but found no leaks or malfunctions that could account for the flooding. As I attempted to salvage what I could from our damaged supplies, transferring dry items to sealed containers and discarding those that had been ruined, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond normal experience. The water incidents, like the apparition I had witnessed that afternoon, seemed to violate the basic laws of physics that governed everyday reality. "Let's just focus on making dinner," I suggested, trying to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy despite my growing unease. "We can figure out the water problem later." But even as I filled a pot with water from our storage container and placed it on the wood stove to boil, I found myself anticipating the next inexplicable event. The cabin that had felt like a refuge from the complexities of modern life now seemed like a place where the fundamental rules of existence no longer applied. As we worked together to prepare our meal, carefully checking each ingredient for water damage, I caught myself frequently glancing toward the counter where I had first discovered the mysterious puddle. Part of me expected to see water materializing again from thin air, defying every rational principle I had spent my life accepting as absolute truth. Dinner proceeded quietly, both of us lost in our own thoughts as we tried to process the day's unsettling events. The pasta tasted fine, though I noticed we were both eating mechanically, without the relaxed enjoyment that had characterized our previous meals in the cabin. Every sound from outside, the settling of the building as temperatures dropped, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine branches, drew our immediate attention. As I washed our dishes in the simple sink, using water sparingly from our container, I found myself examining every surface for new signs of mysterious moisture. The counter remained dry, the table showed no fresh water stains, and our remaining supplies appeared untouched. Whatever force had caused the earlier flooding seemed to have subsided, at least temporarily. "I think I'm ready for bed," Megan announced as I finished cleaning up. "This has been the strangest day of my life, and I'm emotionally exhausted." I understood exactly what she meant. The combination of physical exertion from our morning hike and the psychological stress of the afternoon's bizarre incidents had left us both drained. Sleep seemed like the best escape from the questions that had no satisfactory answers. As a precautionary measure, I dragged one of the metal folding chairs from the dining table and positioned it against the front door. The cabin had no locks. A deliberate choice by the camp's founders to maintain the atmosphere of trust and safety that had characterized this place for decades. But given the day's events, I felt better knowing that any attempt to open the door from outside would result in a loud crash as the chair toppled over. "Good thinking," Megan said, watching my improvised security system, though I'm not sure what we're trying to keep out. That was precisely the problem. I had no idea what we might be dealing with, which made it impossible to take appropriate defensive measures. How do you protect yourself against something that defies rational explanation? In the bedroom, we prepared for sleep with nervous efficiency. I had positioned my sleeping bag so that my head would be near the interior wall, while Megan arranged hers with her head toward the exterior wall beneath the window. This placement had seemed perfectly natural the night before, but now I found myself wishing we had chosen different positions. If something approached the cabin from outside during the night, she would be the first to encounter it. "Try not to worry too much," I told her as I adjusted my pillow. "Whatever's happening here, it doesn't seem to be directly threatening us. We've been here 2 full days, and despite the strange incidents, neither of us has been harmed." She nodded, though I could see the tension in her shoulders as she settled into her sleeping bag. "I know you're right. It's just that everything feels so unpredictable now. I keep expecting something else to happen." I understood her anxiety completely. The sense of security that had defined this place for me over 30 years had been shattered in a single afternoon. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary from the outside world. Instead, it had become a stage where impossible events played out according to rules I couldn't begin to comprehend. As I lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the forest, I found my mind racing through possible explanations for what we had experienced. Could there be some kind of geological phenomenon at work, underground springs or gas emissions that might create unusual atmospheric effects? Might the area be subject to some form of electromagnetic disturbance that could cause hallucinations or distort perception? None of these theories felt adequate to explain the specific details of what I had witnessed. The apparition above the wood rack had possessed a quality of substantiality and purpose that transcended any environmental anomaly. And the water incident suggested intelligence behind the phenomena, as if something was deliberately trying to demonstrate its presence through actions that would be noticed but not immediately threatening. Hours passed as I lay there, alternating between attempts to fall asleep and periods of hypervigilant listening for any unusual sounds. Megan's breathing had gradually deepened and steadied, indicating that exhaustion had finally overcome her anxiety. I envied her ability to find rest. But my own mind remained stubbornly alert, analyzing every creak and rustle from the forest around us. Sometime around 3 a.m, I must have finally dozed off, because I was awakened by the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It began as a faint scratching noise, so soft at first that I wasn't certain whether I was hearing it or dreaming it, but as I lay there with my eyes still closed, the sound grew steadily louder and more distinct. Something was dragging a sharp object along the exterior wall of the cabin, directly behind where Megan slept. The scratching had a deliberate, methodical quality that suggested intelligence and intent. It wasn't the random scraping of a tree branch moved by wind or the clawing of an animal seeking shelter. This was purposeful, controlled, almost ritualistic. As I listened in growing horror, the scratching sound began to move along the wall in my direction. It traveled slowly but steadily, growing louder with each passing second, until it seemed to fill the entire room with its harsh, metallic resonance. The sound bypassed all rational thought and triggered every primitive fear response embedded in my nervous system. When the scratching reached the corner of the room and began moving along the wall behind my head, I felt as if the source was directly targeting me. It continued along the interior wall until it stopped at what felt like the exact midpoint of my body. There, the sound ceased abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow more frightening than the noise itself. In that moment of absolute quiet, I began praying with an intensity I hadn't felt since childhood. "God, please don't let us be harmed," I whispered silently, repeating the plea over and over as I lay frozen beneath my covers. "Whatever this is, please protect us from it." The 30 seconds that followed the cessation of the scratching sound were the longest of my life. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to happen. Would whatever was making the noise attempt to break through the wall? Would it circle around to try the door or windows? Was this merely a prelude to some more direct form of contact? But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, gradually being filled again with the normal sounds of the forest at night. The distant hooting of owls, the rustle of small animals foraging through fallen leaves, the gentle whisper of wind through evergreen branches. Whatever had been systematically scratching along the cabin's exterior walls had apparently departed as mysteriously as it had arrived. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, I finally found the courage to sit up in my sleeping bag. The movement seemed to trigger Megan's awakening, and she rolled over to face me with sleepy confusion. "Dad? What's wrong? You look terrible." I realized that despite the darkness, she could probably see the tension in my posture and the fear that I knew must be written across my features. "Did you hear anything just now? Any scratching sounds along the walls?" She shook her head, clearly puzzled by the question. "I was sleeping pretty deeply. Why? Did something happen?" Part of me was relieved that she hadn't been awakened by the terrifying sounds, but another part felt isolated by being the sole witness to this latest impossible event. How could scratching loud enough to wake me from sleep not have disturbed someone lying just a few feet away? Was I losing my grip on reality, or was there something about these phenomena that affected different people in different ways? "I heard something moving around the outside of the cabin," I said, choosing not to elaborate on the specific details. "It's probably nothing, but I want to get an early start this morning. How do you feel about packing up and heading home today instead of staying for our planned third night?" Relief flooded her expression so quickly that I realized she had been hoping for exactly this suggestion. "That sounds like a good idea," she said without hesitation. "I mean, it's been an amazing experience, but I think I've had enough wilderness adventure for one trip." We both understood that her diplomatic phrasing concealed a desperate desire to escape from whatever was happening at this place. The cabin that had promised peaceful retreat from civilization had become a source of inexplicable terrors that challenged our basic understanding of reality. I rebuilt the fire one last time, partly to provide warmth for our morning preparations, but mostly because the familiar task helped calm my shattered nerves. As coffee percolated on the wood stove, we efficiently packed our gear with the focused urgency of people fleeing a disaster zone. Every item was checked, rechecked, and secured for travel, as if our lives depended on leaving nothing behind. Breakfast was a hurried affair of instant oatmeal and coffee consumed while standing rather than sitting. Both of us seemed reluctant to settle into any routine that might delay our departure. I found myself frequently checking my watch, calculating how long it would take to complete our packing and make the quarter-mile walk back to the parking area. As I was loading our supplies into backpacks, I noticed that Megan kept glancing nervously toward the windows, as if expecting to see something looking back at her from the forest. Her anxiety was contagious, and I found myself doing the same thing, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement or unnatural presence. "Let me ask you something," I said as we made final preparations to leave. "Before we go, I want to check with the camp manager about whether other guests have reported unusual experiences in this cabin. Would you rather wait in the car while I do that, or come with me to the office?" "I'll come with you," she said immediately. "I don't want to be alone anywhere on this property right now." I understood her feelings completely. The sense of safety that should have characterized this remote wilderness retreat had been completely shattered by events that defied rational explanation. Neither of us wanted to spend another moment here alone. We conducted a final inspection of the cabin's interior, ensuring that we had left everything clean and properly arranged for the next guests. The primitive accommodations that had seemed charming and romantic just 3 days earlier now felt ominous and forbidding. I was grateful to step outside and close the door for what I suspected would be the last time. The walk back to the parking area passed in tense silence, both of us alert for any unusual sounds or movements from the surrounding forest. Every snapping twig or rustling branch caused us to freeze momentarily, listening carefully before continuing our retreat. The familiar trail that had seemed like a pleasant woodland stroll when we arrived now felt like a gauntlet to be endured rather than enjoyed. When we finally reached my car and loaded our gear into the trunk, I felt a profound sense of relief that surprised me with its intensity. The simple act of sitting in the driver's seat and turning the key in the ignition represented a return to a world governed by predictable physical laws and rational cause and effect relationships. Before leaving the camp property entirely, I drove to the small administrative building where the camp manager maintained his office. Mr. Andrews had been overseeing this facility for nearly 15 years, and I hoped he might be able to provide some context for what we had experienced. "Any problems with Cabin 7?" he asked as I signed out and returned the key. "Actually, yes," I said, deciding to be direct about our experiences. "We had some unusual incidents that I wanted to ask you about. Have other guests reported anything strange happening in that particular cabin?" His expression immediately became more serious, and I noticed him glance quickly toward where Megan was waiting in the car. "What kind of unusual incidents?" I gave him a brief summary of the major events: the apparition above the wood rack, the mysterious water incidents, and the scratching sounds during the night. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of recognition or understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for several long moments, clearly weighing his response carefully. Finally, he said, "This is the third report of unusual activity in Cabin 7 this season. I've been documenting these incidents and trying to decide whether we should take the cabin out of service temporarily. This revelation was both validating and deeply unsettling. On one hand, it confirmed that we hadn't imagined or exaggerated what had happened to us. Other people had experienced similar phenomena in the same location, suggesting that something genuinely anomalous was occurring there. On the other hand, the fact that the camp management was aware of ongoing problems but had continued renting the cabin raised serious questions about their responsibility to guest safety. "What exactly have other people reported?" I asked. "Similar things to what you've described," he said reluctantly. "Unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own, the appearance of water where none should be present. One family left in the middle of their first night, and a couple from Boston requested a different cabin after experiencing what they called impossible events." As we drove away from the camp that morning, I found myself looking back repeatedly in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something following us down the winding mountain road. It wasn't until we reached the main highway and began our journey back to civilization that I finally began to relax. The 3-hour drive home passed mostly in contemplative silence, both of us processing what we had experienced and trying to integrate it into our understanding of the world. By the time we reached familiar suburban streets, the events at the cabin had begun to take on an almost dreamlike quality, as if they had happened to someone else or in some alternate reality. But I knew I would never forget what I had seen above that wood rack, or the sound of purposeful scratching moving along the cabin's walls in the darkness. Something had shared that forest clearing with us, something that challenged every assumption I had ever made about the nature of reality. To this day, I have never returned to that camp, though I continue to receive their annual newsletters and promotional materials. The part of me that spent 30 years finding peace and renewal in that wilderness setting has been permanently altered by 3 days of impossible events that I cannot explain but can never deny. Sometimes, late at night when sleep proves elusive, I find myself wondering what would have happened if we had stayed for that third night as originally planned. Would the phenomena have escalated? Would we have gained some deeper understanding of what was sharing that space with us? Or would we have found ourselves confronting something far more directly threatening than mysterious scratches and unexplained water? I suppose I will never know the answers to those questions. But I am certain of one thing. There are aspects of our world that extend far beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding, and sometimes, in remote places where civilization has barely left its mark, those hidden dimensions of reality become briefly visible to ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. The Adirondack Mountains continue to draw thousands of visitors each year, most of whom return home with nothing more unusual to report than spectacular sunsets and restorative solitude. But for my daughter and me, that particular corner of the wilderness will forever remain a place where the impossible briefly became real, leaving us with memories that no rational explanation can dismiss or diminish.